Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Robinson, and as Dean of the Divinity School, it is my pleasure, my honor, to welcome you here today for our 2023 Alumna of the Year reception. Every year, the Baptist Theological Union presents the Divinity School Alum of the Year Award to a Divinity School graduate. The entire alumni body is solicited for nominations, which are submitted to our own alumni council, many of whom are in attendance. Finally, the award recipient is chosen for excellence of work and continued contribution to the person's field, recognition and influence beyond the person's immediate sphere, and embodiment of the Divinity School's goals and values, as well as the range and extent of its educational programs. Previous awardees have included Lori Patton, Yaroslav Pelikan, and Benjamin Mays. You are in good company, Terri. Our 2023 Alumna of the Year is Reverend Teresa, as we know her, Terri Owens, who received her Master of Divinity degree from the Divinity School in 2003, only 20 years ago, and in fact the same year I joined the faculty, so we have many things in common, Terri. During her time as a student, she was the recipient of the John Gray Rind Award given to a top MDiv graduate, and also served as a Disciples Divinity House Scholar. But many of you here today will remember Terri not as a student, but as our Dean of Students, a position Terri held for 12 years. During this time, then Dean Owens shepherded almost 1,000 students across our degree programs in areas such as admissions and recruiting, academic advising, professionalization, career discernment, and so very much more, counseling all hours of the day. She was an ambassador for us outside of Swift Hall, representing the Divinity School as campus-wide diversity and inclusion initiatives, and even broader in programs and boards in theological education, including the Hispanic Theological Institute and the Fund for Theological Exploration. A descendant of one of the oldest African-American free settlements in Indiana and a lay leader in the church since young adulthood, Terri Owens earned her BA from Harvard University and enjoyed a career in corporate America before joining us as a student. In addition to excelling in all of this, she has also served on the Board of Trustees of Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, Indiana, and was a founding member of the advisory board for the Center for the Study of Black Faith and Life at Chicago Theological Seminary. In all of her facets, she has advanced the causes of anti-racism, cultural intelligence, and developing inclusive and multicultural communities and organizations. In 2017, Reverend Owens was elected as the General Minister and President of the Christ Church, in parentheses, Disciples of Christ, in the United States and Canada, the first person of color and second woman to lead the denomination. She is the first African American woman to lead a mainline Christian denomination in general. Quite extraordinary. Her lecture today is entitled, A New Church for a New World. After the lecture, just to remind you, there will be a reception in the common room downstairs on the first floor. Now, however, the most important thing is for us to welcome Dean, too many years I knew you as Dean Owens. To welcome General Minister and President Owens to this.
Thank you so much, Dean Robinson. I feel strange just calling him Jim, but this room is filled with not only former teachers, but former colleagues and friends and students who are now alumni, and it's just great to be back in Swift Hall. I can't explain to you how overwhelmed and humbled I am by this honor. For many years, I sat in those seats and watched many other alumni receive this distinction, and I know how important this community has been and is to me. Members of the BTU that I've interacted with over the years, the good work that the BTU does, and I know well, handling financial aid, how important those funds are to make this education possible for so many. So let me say thank you not only for the honor, but thank you for the good work that the BTU continues to do to ensure that the good work for preparing people for ministry in Swift Hall continues. We are all very grateful for the work that you do. I'm looking at so many faces, and I'm not going to call out every name, but I do want to acknowledge members of my family who are here. My husband just texted to say he's pulling up. But my father, Dr. Fred Horde, who is Professor Emeritus of Africana Studies at Knox College. Many of you have heard me talk about him and his influence on my worldview and formation. And Dwight Hopkins, my former advisor as an MDiv student, is here. Good to see you, Dwight. And other members of my family, my dad's wife, who's also named Terri, by the way, another Terri Horde, my brother Mark and his wife Leslie, and my niece Isabella, who was about to finish 5th grade and go into middle school. Yay. My son Mitchell, who was 9 years old when I began as a student, is now married with a 6-month-old baby and a homeowner living on the north side. He is regretfully not able to be here because of some commitments he has with the Chicago Children's Choir, where he serves as composer in residence. But I think Walter's probably running down the street and up the stairs, and many of you may remember Walter. I do want to acknowledge my disciples' roots. I am now the head of communion for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. Dean Chris Culp, who was my advisor and then my colleague and always my friend. So it's always good to see Chris, and my current role allows me to stay connected with the Divinity School and Disciples House through house activities. So Chris, I just want to acknowledge all that you've done to walk with me through a journey that I wasn't sure where I was going when I first started. So it's good to see you here. And also Cynthia Lindner, Director of the Ministry Studies Program, who was just starting my last year and then became a good colleague, and now is even serving on one of the committees of the church to take a look at how we prepare people for ordination and commissioning and what the academic and professional standards should be. So I'm grateful to have somebody from Swift Hall as part of that innovative work. And Cynthia is helping to make sure that we're not just pushing kicking cans down the road, but we're going to turn some stuff up, so I'm grateful for her work. I've entitled this talk, A New Church for a New World. I haven't written a book, at least not yet, although I did write an Advent devotional, but you're going to hear from someone who actually has pastored a congregation and now leads a denomination, and what the church has been through over the last 6 years, how I envision the work and ministry, and where our denomination is headed. I see Clark Gilpin over there. I gotta say hi to Clark and Nancy. Former teacher, Clark was dean when I started as a student, and when I was in the search process, he just came in and said, "Mon capitaine, whatever you need, I'm here to serve." So good to see the Gilpins. A New Church for a New World became sort of a mantra in February of 2020, and it continues to guide and lead the work that we do. And the word imagine has become really powerful, and we'll talk a little bit about what that actually means. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ or the context, I thought I'd share a few historical highlights. We pride ourselves in being the distinctly American denomination, right? The one tradition born of, and I've put frontier in quotes because that has become a problematic word as we talk about our history. What does it mean to call something a frontier when there were people here generations and thousands of years before us? Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell, these two individuals who broke away from their own traditions over issues of what we call as tests of fellowship. The Presbyterian ministers would be in circuit and come to do communion, the Lord's Supper, and you would have to meet with them and sort of have an examination to determine whether or not you were worthy or faithful enough at the moment to receive communion. So we have a chalice, which you see on most of my slides, that is our logo, but that is, most people think, oh, disciples have communion every week. That's not the point. It's not the frequency. It's the concept of open access to the Lord's table to everyone, that there are no tests of fellowship, there are no creeds that you have to sign up for, there is nothing that you have to do. You, by virtue of being a part of God's creation, are always welcome to fellowship at the Lord's table. So there's a commitment to Christian unity. Other famous alumni of this institution, people like Michael Kinnaman, layperson J. Erwin Miller, who is a CEO of Cummins Engine Company, and one of my own personal mentors, very active in Christian ecumenism. The Stone Campbell movement, other parts of it include Churches of Christ and the Christian churches, Churches of Christ. There are independent churches, independent Christian churches, and we share some fellowship also with the United Church of Christ that comes after this same stream. I'm sharing this because I'm going to later talk about some of the changes that we may be making to some of this work. We were not an official denomination until 1969. We were simply a federation of congregations across the United States, Canada, and even the world. And we still have something called a World Convention of Disciples. I have no jurisdiction over those entities. I lead only the church in the United States and Canada, but there are disciples around the world who are connected with us in varying ways. In 1969, we decided, just as denominationalism was headed on the downward slope, that we needed to become a denomination. And the document is called The Design. We celebrated the 50th anniversary of this work at our 2019 General Assembly. And it's interesting that the notion of the design actually came from Paul Tillich, who was involved with the World Council of Churches. And as they were building that worldwide ecumenical organization, he asked the question, what is God's design for the church? And there were disciples involved in that work, and so the notion of a design became important to our forebears. At the same time, there was a large constituency of African American congregations who had created their own fellowship called the National Christian Missionary Convention. They were, and still are, abundantly resourced by the bequest of one Preston Taylor, who was a leader in that movement. And there was a merger agreement that really, they weren't subsumed. The idea was that we would all become one church. And as a result, the leader of that ministry has a seat on the staff of the general minister and president. I would argue that we're probably not living into that merger agreement as fully as it was originally envisioned. Yvonne Gilmore, another alum, just recently completed time as the interim leader of that ministry, and now serves as vice president, chief of staff in my office, which I'm really excited about. But a lot of work has gone on over the past 50 years to try to live into this notion of, long before we created any kind of welcoming or open and affirming statements, the idea that all Christians were welcome, that we wanted to be part of this global ecumenical movement, that Christian unity was the way to really bear witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ. We have a congregational polity, which means that congregations call their own ministers, they buy their own buildings, they control their own destiny. There are three expressions of our church: congregational, regional, and general. We don't say national because we are a binational church. People will say "and Canada" very loudly because we have to remember that Canada is a part of us. I have very little operational direct authority. Our congregations are self-governing. Our regions have their own regional ministers who are middle judicatory. They're bishops, but without the same kind of power. Those regions have their own boards, their own executives. We have 14 general ministries that were created by these congregations long before 1969. Those 14 general ministries have their own boards, their own executives. None of those executives or boards report to me. And I'm not accountable to any of those executives and boards. Disciples are smiling. We have a general board to which all of our ministries are responsible, and we have a general assembly, which is composed of representatives of all our congregations who meet currently every 2 years, and each congregation has 2 votes. There is not another denomination that so grounds that kind of decision-making power within the denominations, within the congregations. And one of the things that I've come to really believe in is how can we strengthen and ensure that that kind of engagement with our congregations continues to grow and develop, particularly as we are now living in a very different kind of world. We're a predominantly white denomination, although we do have African American, Hispanic, and Asian Pacific Islander communities, and there are currently about 2,900 congregations that we believe are connected with us. The context in which I entered my role in 2017 was that we were still working with a vision that was called 2020. 4 key priorities: plant 1,000 new congregations. We did that. By 2020, over 1,100 had been planted, and about 60 of them were still active within the first 5 years. We said we were going to transform 1,000 congregations. We have different programs about transformation. One of the things that was learned was that we really didn't decide how we were going to measure what we meant by transformation. And so, did you go through program A or did you go through program B? And is transformation actually a destination or is it a journey? I would argue the latter. Becoming an anti-racist church is very much in our DNA. We were the first mainline denomination to establish officially that this was a priority for us. Our reconciliation ministry began long before the priority was set. In the early 60s, mid-60s, there was work done in the aftermath of riots and such to really align the work of the church with the movement. The first general minister and president was threatened that he should not allow Dr. Martin Luther King to speak at a general assembly. And Dale Fires, our first general minister and president, did not bow to that pressure and instead invited Dr. King. Our reconciliation ministry initially was doing anti-poverty work, and more recently we've seen a growing number, even during my tenure, a growing number of regions who now require their clergy, in addition to doing not anti-racism, but boundary training and ethical training, that we are requiring across the church for our clergy anyway, anti-racist training. And yet we know that training doesn't get us there. There's still a lot of work to do. And even with all this vision, we are still a mainline denomination. When I was elected, the concerns were declining affiliation among not only disciples' congregations, but across all of mainline Christianity. Declining congregational membership, fewer congregations. Saying we want to transform the church, but what do we mean by transforming? And everyone laying at the new GMP's feet this fear: we are dying. The church is dying. How are you going to help us grow, Terri? How are we going to get new members, new people into our pews? July 2017 through January 2020, there was a proposal on the table called Mission First. Mission First was intending to do a couple of things. One, to coalesce the church around some key, commonly determined mission priorities. And also to structure the general board. At one point in time, our general board was over 300 people. Then it was like 200 people. Bear in mind, this is a representative understanding. And it's hard for our church not to think of having representatives from both congregations and regions and general ministries involved in decision making. Currently, the board is only 117 people. The Mission First proposal was to make it even smaller. There was a call for the General Assembly. They wanted to evaluate the pilot. So one of the first things I did was to create a team that evaluated that pilot, and they made a recommendation to end the pilot and take the lessons learned and give it to the governance committee to do its work. The governance committee is one of the standing committees of the General Board, and as we celebrated our 50th anniversary in 2019, the governance committee met in Tucson in retreat to take a look at two things. One, trying to figure out where the theological underpinnings needed to be for our work as we looked at where we needed to go. And so we reclaimed this theological understanding of covenant, which in recent history had been tied only to monetary allocations of our United Giving Fund. And people would say you're out of covenant as a region if you keep more money than you're supposed to keep. And I talked with several leaders across the church. Some people were concerned about our revisiting this notion of covenant, and others were excited that we would actually reclaim the theological understanding of what it meant to be a covenantal church. We don't have an episcopal form of government. There is no top-down have to. There is only a want to, and understanding what that means in order to be effective as a federation or a communion of congregations was really important. And in our design, there are these words of continued renewal and structural reform. Our forebears knew that we would need to change, and there are abilities and authorities given in this document for us to revisit who we are and how we do our work together. We had gotten stale almost after 50 years in believing that it really always had to look this way. We needed to give ourselves permission to revisit not only what we do, but how. I've been really inspired by the work of Walter Brueggemann, in particular, the prophetic imagination. When early in my tenure, I spent a couple of days here in Chicago at DDH, hung up in the library with a few good friends, and somebody asked me, Terri, what excites you as you travel across the church? The thing that really excites me is when I see people daring to imagine that things could be different. And someone said, let's look at Brueggemann's prophetic imagination. And in the foreword to this, to the 40th anniversary edition, I think, he writes a new foreword, which I didn't actually see this particular quote until I was on sabbatical and rereading this book. God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. That comes from 1 Corinthians 1, 25 through 27. Brueggemann makes the point that we must not only have, the prophet must not only have imagination, but the prophet needs to get inside God's imagination. So bear with me if I preach here a little bit. That's what I do. But it's important to me as a minister and a leader of the church to really ensure that we understand, and I always talk about the omni words that I learned as a little kid in Sunday school. God is omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, all those things. It is a strong part of my own personal theology that the notion of God is limitless. And so when we try to circumscribe what God can do, whom God loves, we have limited God, and therefore God is no longer God. Brueggemann grabs onto this and says that inside God's imagination, there is nothing that you could possibly think or imagine that is beyond what God would want for the church. And that, to me, has been a source of not only inspiration, but it's been something that I've offered up spiritually and theologically to the church. He also says in the prophetic imagination, and I'll sum this up, in essence, you can implement anything that you put your mind to. But you have to be able to imagine and consider exactly what it is that you want to do. The prophet, he says, engages in futuring fantasy. The prophet does not ask if the vision can be implemented, for questions of implementation are of no consequence until the vision can be imagined. The imagination must come before the implementation. Our culture is competent to implement almost anything and to imagine almost nothing. The same royal consciousness that make it possible to implement anything and everything is the one that shrinks imagination, because imagination is a danger. Thus, every totalitarian regime is frightened of the artist. It is the vocation of the prophet to keep alive the ministry of imagination, to keep on conjuring and proposing futures alternative to the single one that the king wants to urge as the only unthinkable one. We have to be able to imagine that things can be different than they are. And once we understand that we have that ability, and as Christians, if we imagine that God is able to do what we have imagined, that there is nothing that we can think about that would actually be beyond God's ability to create or provide, that's a powerful notion and one that drives me personally in my own leadership. So in February of 2020, this was one of the slides from my State of the Church address. We're going to imagine, church, who we are as a new church for a new world. Lehal Moses and I said, hey, is this too Disney-esque? Will people be put off by this notion of, oh, just imagine, and things will change? How real? This was the second week in February 2020. I said we had to have the courage to imagine that our church could do things differently, that we could be a different church, that we needed to give ourselves the permission to change, and not just change for change's sake, but to really consider how we were living as a communion, how we were living as congregations, what relevance our ministries were having in the world in which we found ourselves, but permission to change, and to also claim freedom, most of all from fear. From what happens when we let go of things that are comfortable, when we let go of processes and procedures and even elements of our culture that are comforting to us. I know from my own corporate experience that as you move up in leadership, the system that exists becomes very comfortable to you because it's that system that says yes to your own power and authority. And that happens in ministry. You get very comfortable operating in a particular culture, either within your congregation or your wider denomination. And when things start shifting, you begin to question exactly who you are and what authority and what power you have and what support even that you have to do the work that you do. So this began as a very aspirational thing, and then March of 2020 came. Churches were on lockdown, varying pace of pivoting to virtual worship. Some churches were closed. This was maybe 6 weeks before Easter. We were in the middle of the Lenten season. Many churches had not gone to online giving, began to have serious financial impact in many cases. Pastoral care, we all remember the inability to visit people in homes and hospitals, the inability to gather for funerals. Families were grieving without the benefit of gathering, and pastors were carrying that load, and they were under great stress, and it was palpable. We were all in the grip of this great unknown, not sure what was coming. One of my first thoughts, I must admit, when we went into lockdown was what's happening at the University of Chicago. In my own role, I would have been actively involved in figuring out how we were going to do long-distance instruction and how we would communicate with the students. So I thought about you all too and knew that everyone was doing something new. One of the great gifts of the pandemic for our church was the collaboration across 14 general ministries who are very individually resourced. Their authority structures don't require them to collaborate, but they came together, and weekly we met in a general ministries task force. Our pension fund has control of what we call the Clergy Relief and Assistance Fund. They were making grants to congregations to support clergy if offerings were down. The Disciples Church Extension Fund was deferring loans. We make a lot of capital and other kinds of loans to congregations. They were deferring loans and making it possible for people to move through this difficult financial period. They've more recently been giving congregations technology grants to update their infrastructure. Disciples Home Mission started our domestic ministry, if you will, did a lot of virtual Christian education resources, particularly for families with children. National Benevolent Association, we call it MBA. It's not that MBA, but it's our MBA. They redirected a lot of their funds to support congregations who had community-based ministries. They, along with Week of Compassion, which is led by a disciple, Reverend V. Nguyen, gave grant monies for those who were not eligible for federal assistance programs. That included a lot of pastors in the Hispanic and Asian Pacific Islander community, and even Haitian pastors whose immigration status would not have allowed them to apply for assistance. And so we saw our ministry shifting the use of their funds to support what was happening in the congregations. And I think our congregations felt the outreach from the general ministries, as opposed to saying, here, I have this program for you. It was here. How can I help you? And we made good decisions, and we pivoted, and we moved our resources to where the need was. We also created something called Disciples Tech Corps. I have an IT background, and one of the things that we saw was that folks just didn't know how to set up these kinds of cameras, and people didn't know what was adequate Wi-Fi in their buildings. So we now have a Facebook group where people can go and ask technical questions, and they can get connected with consultants or people who are just lay folks, IT folks, and love the church and want to help out. My office was focused on church-wide connection and communication. I went from recording 2 videos a year and 2 statements to recording weekly videos in my home. My husband, Walter, who is here now, was my producer and set designer. And only recently have we stopped doing that. Virtual church hopping as a way to be present. Our congregations were on Facebook Live and YouTube. I spent Sundays, instead of traveling, I was hopping time zone to time zone, visiting congregations. And my phone today on Sunday still pings because I'm following all of our congregations, and I'm still seeing who's online. I started online prayer time with clergy. I still do a Facebook Live session on Wednesday, inviting anybody who wants to join me for about 20 minutes of prayer. That first Easter, we created a fully pre-produced worship service with a sermon from me and a communion meditation and music from across the church, so that pastors could feel confident that they had some kind of worship service, that even if they just played it in their sanctuary and broadcast it or put it on YouTube, that they had something for that holy day that would help them. Weekly online meetings with our regional ministers and our general ministries. Virtually, we came to understand how much we could get done virtually. The intentionality of our communications and our messaging, our coordination of PPP loans. We have 31 regions. There's a function within my office called Treasury Services that does accounting for 21 of those regions and for some of our smaller general ministries. And so our chief financial officer managed the PPP loan process, both the application and then subsequently the forgiveness for that. I was on Zoom calls I'm on the governing board of the National Council of Churches and on the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches. All around the world, people were asking, how can we help? Reaching out to countries where Christians were already under fire and where economic impact was already making it difficult to figure out how the combined resources of Christianity across the world could be used. And then a historic vote that the General Board made to cancel our 2021 General Assembly. That's the only place we can make real decisions. So we spent a lot of time, spent a lot of dollars with attorneys trying to get us out of hotel contracts, et cetera. And the moderator team, which is a group of 4 people, a moderator-elect, and a first and second vice moderator, who are the elected officers of our governing body, the General Assembly, served an additional 2 years as a result. They are the longest serving moderator team in the history of our church. So what did we learn? I talked with some of our students at DDH last year, just as we were coming back into being in person, and I talked about being able to build capacity. Capacity is not only the ability, but it's key competencies to be able to imagine, pivot, and change. Believe it or not, some of us don't have those capacities. Some of us are very comfortable just following party line or following processes. And our first thought is always, I want to get back what I had. That's been one of the challenges of the church. We've learned that we can do things that we've never done before. We've learned that we can work virtually. I don't have to be everywhere. I can record a video. I can preach live on Zoom. Our regional ministers are understanding they don't have to be in their cars going everywhere. We have younger generations who are more digitally native, who are happily creating relationships and interacting digitally. We can do that too. And in many places, we learned that we simply weren't prepared with the technical infrastructure that we needed, not only for worship, but for communication. And online giving, something that the church had been pushing, but we spent a lot of time consulting with churches about how to implement online giving. We have to maintain an online presence in the church. In addition to having returned to in-person worship, there are people who are finding our congregations who probably would never have walked through their doors. And so how do we embrace those people? How do we feel welcome? How do we minister to those people? Many of them are what people would call seekers. Many of them maybe were a part of a church or maybe even a different denomination. And some of our churches are thinking, oh, well, now that we're back to in-person worship, we can just shut down the virtual aspect of our worship service. Many churches are actually creating what they call e-pastors. So while you're online, there's somebody in the chat who's talking to folks and finding out what their needs are, what their prayer concerns are, inviting them to different events, inviting them to give, and doing that kind of pastoral care online. And it's a very interactive kind of thing, and many of our congregations are learning that that's the kind of interaction that we're going to need to have. There is no return to before. There simply is no going back. And we are actually more open to change now than ever before. Some of the things that will be before the General Assembly would not have even been considered had we not gone through this process of the pandemic to understand. And so we don't have to imagine a new world. It landed on us. We don't have to think about what it would be like to be in a new world, but we do have to imagine who we are as a church. What we call the Covenant Project, and I'm going to go through what I call our top 3 projects right now that are more forward-looking and have all been impacted by our experience of being a church sort of in the wilderness. You know, there's this old spiritual that says, tell me, how did you feel when you come out the wilderness? Leaning on the Lord. And I feel like the church is starting to kind of come out of the wilderness. The Covenant Project is really an attempt to embrace connections across our denomination and get more congregational connection and engagement, not only with the regional manifestation of the church, but with the general manifestation of the church. And why is that important? In our current structure, we meet every 2 years. The general board may vote on resolutions that will come before us. We may have 2 or 3 months to think about those things, and we come 2,000, 3,000 people poorly prepared to deliberate and decide on what is before it. There needs to be much more active engagement, listening, learning, as well as discernment before we get to decision point. We're calling it the Covenant Project because we found that Governance Project made people's eyes roll to the back of their heads. This timeline shows you how long we've been working on it. Since that retreat in September 2019, we just put a resolution before the General Board 3 weeks ago, and there were some changes made to it, but will go to the General Assembly in July in Louisville, Kentucky. A lot of back and forth with the various aspects of our governance system, but it reminds us that instead of having this committee that typically only met once a year, this committee has been meeting once a month, and different pieces of it more times than that, for 4 years. To make change happen, to put ideas together, to make sure there are enough voices participating in the idea. This idea of a general board that's up here, and it thinks about things maybe once a year, and we take these very small incremental steps, the pace of change can no longer support that kind of structure. We can't afford, quite honestly, to have 117 people meeting in person. We have the ability to do it differently. We are still who we are. Our ethos is not based on that general board. Our ethos is based on the idea that from our congregations come ideas. From our congregations, the engagement and interaction needs to happen. And from that level of affiliation come the good ideas and the moving forward. Our current decision-making process, we have an administrative committee, which is an executive committee of our board. Ideas come through representatives from our regions and our congregations. That goes to a general board once a year. The administrative committee meets twice a year, and then the General Assembly meets every 2 years. There's not a whole lot of ability to dialogue about things and take action in between those 2 years. The new process envisions virtual conversations to provide both education, listening, and making decisions. One of the things that happened during when we canceled our 21 General Assembly is that we weren't able to take action because of the way our rules were set, and we weren't able to effectively communicate or educate people about key social issues. It happens that we have the ability for the General Minister and President and 2 other executives to make statements in social witness, and we had to utilize that authority. But we're moving to an environment that still honors a congregational polity, that still honors the middle judicatory level at the regional level, but invites us as General Assembly, as church, to be in constant dialogue, to learn from one another, to raise issues, and to map ways forward, build relationships, and hopefully build a greater sense of connection across the life of the church. So we are acknowledging the fact that we've already been given the authority to change. We have to give ourselves permission to move forward. I'm going to move a little more quickly through these. The Church Narrative Project is a relatively new project, although it had its beginnings 2 or 3 years ago, working with David Anderson Hooker, formerly of Notre Dame, working in their Peace Studies department. The notion that we all move with our stories. Even though I might know your story and you might know mine, we're all still living under a presumed narrative. It's sort of like cars on a highway. We can only go where the roads take us. And even though I know your car very well and you know mine and we know the road really well, we sometimes have to build new roads. The Covenant, the Church Narrative Project is, Reverend Yvonne Gilmore is leading that for us. She calls it reverse musical chairs. Region by region, we're beginning with a storytelling hour. We're inviting people to listen, to get to know one another, and then we're inviting them to talk about what is the problematic that you see locally, regionally in the church. And then we talk about the vision that we have for what the church not only should do, but what it should be like. What are the things that if you were to say, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, what would come to your mind? How can we show up in similar ways despite geographic and ethnic and racial differences across the life of the church? Again, this building capacity in an increasingly polarized society, I believe the church can lead in building that kind of capacity. The work that we used to do in cultural intelligence here when I was Dean of Students requires us to learn how to listen and think alongside people who think differently. That's the work in this building. And we have to build that capacity in our churches, in all of our human systems. Regions have the opportunity to even benefit from this as they shape their own vision. And we've now done 3 regions, and we have about 6 to 10 more lined up, about 1 a month for the rest of the year. And we may have to double up to get to all the regions that we hope will participate. That feedback is going to come back to mapping onto each other so that we build this emerging narrative of a shared future. The Proclamation Project is a recent grant that we got from the Eli Lilly Foundation, the Lilly Endowment, $1.5 million. Reverend Lee Holm Moses is now the executive director of that project. The goal was to provide preaching resources, realizing that clergy have just come through a season where everything they learned in seminary, all the cultural norms that they had experienced in their congregations have literally been pulled out from underneath them. The goal was even not so much young clergy the first 5 years. Lilly has lots of programs for new clergy in their first 5 years. We're really targeting mid-career folks who want to better understand. Some people don't use slides or using video or music, or how you can communicate so that what you're doing and saying comes across well in virtual and digital spaces. We've already had one preaching workshop in January where we invited 3 preachers to preach on the text that will be used for our General Assembly, and we had over 200 people online for that. And people are clamoring for these resources. We're doing some survey work to find out what the needs are, but we're excited about the Proclamation Project. I'm going to skip ahead and really kind of bring this to a close. Where do these 3 projects connect? Again, it's about building capacity. It's about enabling people to have the courage to change, equipping them to pivot as they need to, giving people freedom from fear about what change means. And one of the most important aspects of all of this work, as we talk about building capacity and shifting systems and making systems more nimble, is that if the Christian Church Disciples of Christ really believes that unity is our polar star, unity is not unanimity. We're a more diverse church, increasingly more diverse church. The fastest growing community in our church is what we call North American Pacific Asian Disciples, Asian and Pacific Islanders, the Chukis community. And many of these congregations are not congregations that we're starting. They are established congregations that are deciding that they want to be part of our church. How do we ensure that those stories, that those traditions, that the respect that we give to one another is enlivened, but that is also part of the ongoing ethos? And I've said before, and I'll say again, that the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, as I have experienced it, it is a predominantly white church that has decided that it wants to let groups of color sit at the table. And even as its first GMP of color, I have experienced patronization, misogyny, racism, people treating me like I'm 12 years old, like I must not know anything because I haven't worked on the general level of the church before. These are real things that happen not only in our denomination, but across Christendom. It's still an issue for women to lead in religious communities. It's still an issue for people of color to lead in predominantly white contexts. I've been very open and candid about that, but I think that the capacity that we're trying to build by shifting our processes is to allow the ethos that we really can actually be who we say we are. A church that's committed to being a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. A church that's committed to Christian unity. And in order to do that, we've got to get better at listening and understanding one another's stories. We've got to get better at being willing to do things differently. We can't decide what the norm is based on our own experiences, because we will miss out on phenomenal ideas and phenomenal opportunities for growth. And if, as Christians, our concern is simply bearing witness to the limitless love of God, then we've got to build the capacity to be the church that we say we are, and build in those kinds of theological and human interaction skills that allow us to come together, listen, learn, discern, and decide. So I'll end it there. Thank you so much for your time. Sure. Yes, sir.
I'm UCC, so we have some of the same issues. The whole notion of covenant can be interpreted as something that we do as a community in a binding or bonding way, but we may not see covenant as something that's public, that's something that's listening to stories outside our own faith, building, as it were, kind of bridging social capital, connecting with the community around us. So it's not just our story we're telling ourselves, but it's a story we're listening to with those who may be not part of our sense of we-ness. So have you thought much about, I know you have, the public dimension of this strategy, how you connect to the communities around you, not just in the we-ness of the congregation?
Exactly. Thank you for that question. I hope everybody heard it. How does this show up in a public-facing kind of way? One of the things that we talk about a lot is that we don't do ministry alone, and ministry is contextual. And so wherever you are individually, your individual as a congregation, the public ministry that you are doing should be in some ways a reflection of how you see yourself as part of this larger whole. Dr. Anderson Hooker has a concept, it's actually not his, he just uses it, called fractal practice, right? So that inside a particular organism, there are things that show up that are similar in size, not size, but in function. So that whether you're in Oregon or Hawaii or Indiana or Illinois, there is a certain ethos or a certain way of practicing that shows up, even though you might be white, brown, Hispanic. So the theological notion of how you show up in public witness has to be a reflection of the covenant that you've entered into. I don't think you have to say, hey, we're in covenant. That's not the goal, to broadcast the idea of covenant. But the covenant is what we hope makes the entire system, the entire fellowship, the entire organism of this church stronger so that it can do that public-facing work. And I think it's the results of the work that will make us stronger. If we engage in covenant, a great example and one that's easy to understand for disciples is our Week of Compassion. We're in covenant with Week of Compassion. We give, this is our disaster recovery and refugee resettlement ministry. We give to Week of Compassion, and the covenant is if you have a disaster in your area, you know Week of Compassion is going to show up and check on you, and you know you have resources and funding. There's not a contract there, but it says a whole lot to the community that you are a part of this church that responds not only to your congregation, but to the needs in the community. So I think the contextual aspect of ministry is the public-facing piece, and the covenant is really the inner ties that bind, but hopefully in a loving way. That we're living out covenant, we're not preaching covenant outwardly, if that makes sense. And I say that not because I'm asking if I'm being clear when I say that. No. Other questions? Bill Schweiker.
Thank you very much. This is great. And addressed a lot of the institutional problems that churches around the United States and the world are addressing. The experience in my denomination, the United Methodist Church, is that we're being ripped apart more by cultural divisions along several fault lines that the institution, no matter how construed, can really address. We could all tick off what those issues are, right? You haven't addressed them. I was wondering if you could just say a few words about how the disciples are trying to address these things. The Methodist Church is basically failing on this, if I may say so. But I'd be really interested to see how the disciples are addressing this.
And we probably all know what those hot button issues are. I don't mind naming them. They're race, gender, sexual orientation, and even the conflation of political ideology within the context of the church. So there are congregations where we have pastors who are afraid to preach anything about social justice for fear that they will lose their jobs. There are people who will pull my coattails and say, why did you speak about that? Or you should speak about that. Or why did it take you so long to say anything about that? Because we have that congregational polity, we are able, for example, to pass a resolution, which is the strongest way that our church can speak at the General Assembly. And those are called sense of the assembly resolutions. They're not binding on any of our congregations. Part of the goal of this new way of doing General Assembly is because we often vote on these assemblies without really being well educated on the issues that we're speaking about, and we can get triggered by a word here or a word there and decide that, I disagree with that. And we really don't have, and capacity is the best way that I can explain, we don't have the ability, we haven't practiced. We haven't decided that it's worth it to sit down and talk with people who disagree with us. And from a disciple's perspective, for me, that's about really staying at the table and not making it a thorny place for other people with whom you disagree to sit. So our mechanisms, I as general minister and president can issue a statement and I take stances on things all the time. Post George Floyd, we recently, we're about to issue a pastoral letter on anti-trans legislation. And it took us a while to do it, and our LGBTQ community is upset with me because it's taken so long. But what I was trying to do was to make it a statement where I could get sign-on from both our regional and general leaders so that it had more heft and more representation of the life of the church. So part of our problem is that there's no one place that can speak for the whole church except the General Assembly. So I can say what I want, and people disagree, they will get mad at me, and that's their right to do that. And I just, and so I speak a lot about things. My most famous video was probably the one after January 6th. And I got a lot of pushback about this video. I was sitting at my kitchen table watching them pound on the doors, right? And going, what in the world is going on? And so I wrote to my team and said, okay, we're going to do a video on this. And I was talking, and I said, you know, if those had been black bodies knocking on those doors, they'd all be dead. Ooh. And that came out of passion. And maybe if I had thought more about it, it was actually something that wasn't in my little script that I had written, but it was true. And so I stood by it. And there have been lots of opportunities where I've had to speak and I've had to weigh true, what Terri can stand and say, and recognizing that you can disagree with me. And that's your right within our polity to do that. And I think this building of capacity of learning and listening, urban versus rural, some of the communities that we're talking to about the Church Narrative Project, everyone's afraid that somehow we're going to do something that locks down the disciples' theology, that we're going to slide in some kind of open and affirming statement, or we're going to make you be anti-racist, when all we really want is, could you just come and sit down, and could you tell me your story and I'll tell you mine, and we'll talk openly without judgment about what we want for our church and what matters in our lives. And we don't have a society that supports that anymore, and we're feeling that in our church. And it may be that we won't get there, at least probably not during my term, but I feel compelled to try. And I think disciples probably come the closest to having that real ethos, that all voices are welcome at the table, and we've got to figure out a way to stay there as opposed to walking away from it. When we have congregations who disagree with something that I've said or something that's happened in a congregation, I wonder, not that you can say anything's disciple, but how is getting up and leaving the table disciple? That, for me, is against our ethos. It's a hard thing to sit at the table with people that you disagree with. But if you believe in not only Christian unity, but the global witness that can actually make, like, how do those people do that? Like, how do they even get along? How do they walk together even when they disagree? That, to me, is a pretty powerful witness for Christian unity. And we're not there, Bill. We're certainly not there, but we have all the same issues. Our system allows some escape valves, perhaps, because you can speak and you can tell people you're not bound by it. But yeah, I take heat all the time for speaking, and I've just decided that I have to. Somebody says, oh, Terri, don't say anything that will divide the church. Well, the church it's already divided. I think I need to, if you believe that you've called a leader to lead, then you have to allow me to speak and lead. So, but I certainly appreciate, and we pray for our United Methodist siblings.
And you convince us about all the things that you've said. I know that personally, that's not always so easy, right? What is your practice personally that allows you to say what's true, to hear people say, well, we don't like you, or we'll leave, and to go out the next day and say truth again? What do you do? How do you do that?
I have spiritual practices. These are important things. We did a webinar yesterday about gun violence with our mental health ministry within the National Benevolent Association. And they were like, well, what are your practices? How, I'll have to, and I don't know what your politics are, but after Trump was elected, I took myself off of cable news for about a month. And there are times when I just have to retreat, but I practice centering prayer, meditation. I journal. One of the things that I've said to the church is that if we are Christians, and this is something I've witnessed up close and personal here at the Divinity School, every tradition has a sacred text. And if you're going to practice this religious tradition, you need to know your sacred text. You need to wrestle with it, and I'm not talking about dogma, but you need to know the text. You need to be familiar with it. So I spend time regularly in some kind of devotional reading. One of the great joys of being a pastor in Downers Grove was teaching Bible study and helping people understand they could wrestle with it and ask questions. I have a spiritual director. I'm very close to getting a therapist. It's only because I've had such benefit from my spiritual director. I have an executive coach. I have people who are outside the realm of influence or authority over me. So nobody on my general board, nobody, and actually not even fellow clergy and the disciples. My spiritual director is not my denomination. My executive coach is not in my denomination. And so there have to be people that you can go to who will say, Terri, have you thought about this? Or when I'm trying to process things. I sent my coach the State of the Church video. And she gave me it was very affirming, and I felt very good. But this is a person who's outside the bounds of the scale. But I spend time every day just being quiet and in prayer, and for me, that's an important Christian spiritual practice. And again, I have watched people of all faith traditions in this building take their sacred text very seriously, and Christians need to do a better job of that. Part of the reason that we have so much division is that we don't have a common understanding of what that text says. Either we understand it dogmatically or we're woefully ignorant of it. And there has to be a way that as Christians, we find some kind of center there. But find networks and make friends outside of the realms in which you minister so that you have not only accountability partners, but safe spaces with whom you can talk and discuss, and people that you can, have a beer, drink a wine with, or go to the opera with, or people that you can talk. And I have I don't know if you call it a kitchen cabinet, but I also have people in the church who know the church, who aren't part of my accountability structure, to whom I can say, hey, this sounds really crazy. Or I just got this email, or we've got to address this thing. So I hope that's what you were getting at. Plus, I was raised by some pretty powerful people. My mom passed away about 18 months ago, and my dad used to make us read a book a week by or about black people, or we didn't get half of our allowance. And so I was raised in my household to know that there are other people in the world beside you. I saw that lived out with my grandfather. And so part of the strength to do what's right comes from the examples that were set before me. So when I hear my son speaking to things, or the things he writes for the Chicago Children's Choir, having such a justice passion, I know that somehow I've done something right. But you can call me and talk to me. I'd be happy to talk to you. But yeah, spiritual director and therapist, spiritual practice, friends outside the church, all very important. Yes?
So I'm not a divinity student. I'm in the social work school, but thank you. But one of my personal passions is dialoguing in community in a time of really severe polarization. And this is what my Peace Intern workshop was about. Just a plug. It's out there. The curriculum is free for everyone to use. It's on the DPF website. Anyway, but sorry, it's shameless. But my question was, you talked about, the importance of staying at the table, and with people who you don't agree with. And I was just kind of curious what your thoughts were, and if you can't elaborate on them because of the nature of your position or because you're still wrestling with the answers yourself, I understand that. But just kind of what do we do as a church when there's a lot of harm taking place, or people feel unsafe because of fissures or disagreements, and I guess like, I don't know, and I guess I'm partly looking for maybe something like spiritual, but also something practical about like how do we create safe spaces to have, dialogue when people's identities really are being brought up into this. And I don't know, I've wrestled with it a lot. So yeah.
Absolutely, and that is something that I think the church wrestles with, because I'm just as concerned about the people who currently don't feel safe, and I'm also concerned about the people who feel bound to decide that those people don't belong there, so I'm leaving the table. This whole listening, learning, discerning, and deciding, we passed a resolution in 2019, for example, that called the church to educate itself about what it means to be a transgender person. A lot of people are just ignorant about a great many things. And we as a church have to ensure that there's education taking place. I know, I've been a black woman all my life. And so I know that the burden of having to try to educate people about your story and all that, and that's not something that you want to lay at the feet of people who are marginalized. But we do have to take it upon ourselves to learn and to establish ground rules for the table. The table's not a free-for-all. There's some ground rules there. And one of the essential ground rules is that you're just as welcome as I am. And if people don't get that, part of me sometimes says, if you're not willing to be at this table and respect the other people that have a right because they're a creation of God to be at the table, then maybe this isn't the church for you. Maybe there are other vineyards in which you would serve, and that may seem heretical for the leader of the denomination to be saying, but I don't think that people get to veto the values that we hold because they don't like them. There has to be a higher standard, and we have to do it. It's hard work to ensure that people not only feel safe, and it's hard work to say to you, I know this seat's going to be a little thorny and hot, but I really need you to stay and help me work through some things. I used to, as a teenager, do anti-racism stuff with the Y Teens in Terre Haute, Indiana. Me and one other black girl and hundreds of girls doing anti-racism training at night. And there were times when Cherise Moore, she and I are still in touch with one another, we're like, why are we here? And this is not really a safe place in Terre Haute, Indiana for me to be there. But I learned a whole lot about asserting myself and understanding even recognizing the ignorance that was around me, and it served me well in later life. But actual safety, people don't feel safe. The church has to stand up and say, there are rules to being at the table. There are guidelines for entering this space. And if you don't like the guideline that says everyone is safe and is respected, again, I would say to you, perhaps there are other vineyards in which you would like to serve. And people look at me and say, oh. I really think Christianity will get smaller institutionally before it gets bigger, because we've got to divest ourselves of the institutional things to which we've come so familiar and accustomed. And we've gotten comfortable that it works this way. Young graduates are like, well, the church should be providing me with a job and a living wage. Congregations, a couple slides I didn't get to, many more part-time pulpits. I was an anomaly as a student because I wasn't interested initially in being full-time pastor because I was working in corporate America. I was like, I can't take that kind of cut in pay. I can't do that. And I was like, oh God, how am I going to serve in this ministry? But we've got to understand that things are shifting. And even as you're thinking about the next step in your vocation or your ministry, paying attention to what's out there on the landscape. There are very few large pulpits that can pay pastors really large salaries. So we're seeing across seminaries people doing dual degrees, second career people, many more second career people discerning ministry, and we're having to find a way to treat them as though they're just as valuable as the person who went from BA to MDiv. I was treated by the region when I went through ordination as, well, we hope that you will eventually be committed enough to become a full-time pastor. Those aren't the answers. So the way in which we think about things is different, but we've got to lay down some rules to be safe that are there. I say there are certain roads love can't take. Love can't take the road of discrimination or exclusion or homophobia or racism. So if you really believe in Christian love, there's certain places you can't go with that. There's certain, you can't exclude people from God's realm of love. You just can't do that. That for me is such a core theological concept, and it guides everything I think about and do. And so if you don't believe that your little rules get to decide this, then maybe, like I said, there are other vineyards. Maybe there are congregations where you'll be comfortable, but you won't get me as an advocate for that. I hope I answered your question. Thank you, Waldo. Professor Waldo Johnson. Yes.
Dean Owens, because you will forever be Dean Owens to me. I want to, well, one, as a part-time pastor now, I want to thank you because the first time that I ever preached 4 weeks in a row was for you at First Christian Church of Downers Grove. So I want to ask, you talked a little bit about the building capacity for innovation, change, and the ability to pivot. I want to ask about people who are a little bit in the middle, who are not looking to leave the table and really also not excited about change. Who, for them, the tradition that they've clung to, that they're clinging to, really has deep meaningfulness, has transformed their lives. They've seen transformation in society based on this tradition, and who are not really ready to let that go for innovation and change that might need to happen. Can you talk a little bit about how you soften the ground for those folks to help lead the horse to water, so to speak?
Yeah. And I think there's a difference between spiritual practice, liturgical tradition, and the systems that hover and the processes that govern and keep a denominational or an ecclesial system together. You can be in a church that has very traditional, worship style is one thing, right? And I think what I'm talking about is the world beyond the congregation, how the parts become a whole, and the ways in which we connect and make connection and make decisions together in the larger stage. But most of our church is there, right? Most of our church is at a place where I like being a member of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And we're happy here in Katy, Texas, or wherever we are, and I may be involved in the region, I may not. I don't know why I have to spend more time connecting with all you people, because we're happy in our little church. The importance of building the capacity to pivot may not skip a generation, but it's just as important that we bring younger people to the table sooner. We have to get rid of these quotas in some places where, I have one youth representative. I look at the decision-making team for the worship at General Assembly. They're all much younger than I am, in 30s and 40s, and they have challenged me in a lot of different ways that make me uncomfortable. But I'm also having to think about the church that I'm leading. I want my son to want to raise his son in this church. And my son's 32. So I need to be listening to young adults and young families about what's meaningful for them in terms of the broader community of the church. And pastors need to be thinking about that as well. We have to pay attention to what the world needs from us, and the fact I was once a young adult. I was once the one pounding on the table saying, this doesn't work for me, I want to do something different, or why don't we think about X, Y, Z? So I'm not trying to attack the tradition or the, if you want to sing everything out of the Chalice hymnal, and your Disciples Women Group is what it is, all of these things that are near and dear to us, excellent. Coffee hour, try to take coffee hour away from our congregations, they would riot. But I came to learn that coffee hour is where I got to know people. Stayed for coffee hour, figured out what was happening, learning, and people are interested in making tweaks once they feel that they've been heard. So there's a difference, I think, between the beauty of the tradition that really is our commitment as Christians to hand off, right? There is a core Christian tradition that we need to be passing on to new generations, but the institutional form that takes and how we as a denomination If we're not careful, this whole that we think is supporting us will fold under its own weight, because we're not connecting to it in the right way anymore. We're not supporting it in the right way. We're not finding meaning in it in the right way. And so we've got to figure out a way, how does that whole exist to help all the individual pieces? And I don't think it means attacking liturgical or worship tradition or other things that are important. It does mean perhaps opening your heart and mind to people all over the globe and to people of all identities. But I'm not trying to go in and tell you how to worship, or we're not trying to do that. We're trying to build the connections so that even if you are different in how you live out that tradition, you not only feel part of the whole, you help to support the whole, and so the whole is healthy to support you. Yes, ma'am.
You said something about the expectation that a church pay a full-time pastor. And while I hear the comment about growing by vocationality, in a lot of places and times that seems to take the form of the pastor is doing by vocationality because they must. They're not called to bag groceries and be a pastor. They're called to be a pastor. They're called to one thing and not two or three, and that veers into sort of the side hustle mentality that is part of our common culture. So my question is, you've talked a little bit about the social issues that divide the church, but I'm curious what you would say to sort of economic issues, where one reason it's hard to pay a lot of pastors is a narrow slice of people have taken all the money. And so I'd be interested to hear how you think we can move forward with an economic message as well as a social one.
Really good question. There is no nobility in poverty. Let me just say that. And one of the things our regional ministers are doing increasingly is doing salary benchmarking in the various regions to determine what good, not just good church pastor salaries are, but good nonprofit leadership and management salaries are. Part of the problem that we have is that we have churches that have become too small to have a critical mass to function well. And so if you've got 12 people, and you may be in an area where there are a lot of different congregations within your denomination, and you're so tied to your identity as being ABC Christian Church, and you can no longer support the ministry that you want to do, and all you could barely do is open the doors for worship and have coffee. That we're seeing more and more congregations looking at sharing resources and figuring out a way to create better, not only employment, but ministry opportunities for pastors. We're seeing regions, there are 3 regions in our church, Nebraska, Kansas City, and Kansas, that have been in a 2-year conversation talking about not only how they do ministry together, but they're now starting to talk about how they share resources. Downstate Illinois, lots of small towns that are disappearing because industry is moving. Communities are drying up in certain places. So those churches, the kids that grew up there aren't coming back, right? They're away. But I think we've got to do a better job of leaders. And people are in a lot of discernment conversations with churches about closing or uniting. And that's another point of change. We have such pride in our local congregation that the idea that it wouldn't exist or that it might become part of something else is hard for us to do. But if we want good ministry to take place, if you want to attract, we've got lots of part-time pulpits that are open and not a lot of candidates who are interested in those. And congregations are like, you're holding back on the good people. It's like, no, there actually just aren't a lot of people interested in that particular opportunity. So it has to happen, I think, on both sides. And the congregation doing that good discernment about, so who are we and what are we doing right now? Does this make any sense any longer? Why are we open? What are we doing? Is there a different way? And we've seen lots of ministries, congregations end their earthly ministry, bequest resources to other congregations or to other ministries in their communities. And that's a spiritual journey that has to happen with congregations. So I think that's a part of it too. It's not just coming up with the money to pay someone, but congregations taking a realistic look at where they are. A lot of our congregations that have closed in the last year or so were on the bubble anyway, and the pandemic moved them to a different place. Because if you're not willing to change and pivot when the pandemic hit, it literally just sent some people, I hate to say over the edge, but people had to make different decisions. So this is all a spiritual journey. A church is not a club. It's lots of organizations you can join, have a 501c3 and do good work. Church has to have different motivation, different kind of preparation for its leaders, and good ministry leaders are trying to help those people understand why they're there, and then they can have those kind of conversations.
The impression I get from many of my clergy colleagues and peers is that they are tired for many of the reasons that have been named today. How do you specifically build the capacity for imagination for people who are burned out and tired?
Again, one of the slides I chose to slip over, we have a lot of people who are not only burned out, but people are retiring early. We've got a lot of retirees. People are just saying, I'm done. And it's too hard because it's no longer effective for them to do what they had always done. And if they feel that they don't know what to do next, or they simply feel like they're pushing the proverbial stone up the mountain or whatever. There's a lot of work happening in various regions. Almost half of our regional ministers are new. We have 31 regions, 28 people serving those 31. I just installed last weekend the 11th regional minister in 6 years, and we have 6 regions searching for new regional ministers. So part of the work of providing pastoral care falls there. You see organizations like the Pension Fund having events that provide people with respite. Conferences. One of the things I find is sad is that people are trying to tack on vacation days to trips to serve on certain boards because that travel is the only way they'll be able to take a vacation. I have to keep myself in check about becoming overtired and overworked and over-traveled, et cetera. But we really have to, and regional ministers are talking about this, and a lot of them are new, and a lot of them are carrying the weight of that stress that's out there. So I don't think we have all the answers yet, but I think we have to resource our pastors, we have to provide safe space. The regional ministers had a weekly meeting during COVID that really was about checking in with each other. There are different programs that we have that give you cohort groups during your first 5 years. We tried to start right before COVID sort of a clergy under 40 group to say, hey, what would be helpful to folks in terms of keeping your head above water and continuing to energize yourselves, and we're going to return to that now that we're kind of out of a less than crisis situation. But I don't have the answer for you, Jack. I just know that we see it and we know it, and regional ministers are talking about it all the time. Everywhere I go, people talk about it, and as we look at changing the criteria for the order of ministry in the church, not just for the sake of change, but to say, what does it really mean to be a well-prepared and equipped minister in this day and time? And how can the academy support that preparation? And how could the church support that preparation? Is a traditional 3-year MDiv the only way that you can get there? Are there other, and this ministry program has grown over the years to bring in other faculty who have practical ministry experience. Cynthia's been great at getting lots of good outside grant money to do cohort programs, and we have projects like the Bethany Fellows and other things that give people this cohort space, and I think that kind of community is really necessary in ministry. The other thing is to ensure that in our decision-making process, we have many more younger pastors who were involved in some of these bodies and decision-making. You shouldn't have to wait until somebody retires to chair a general board, or you need to be in places where those voices of the people who are tired and stressed are heard by many more people, so that we can leverage all the resources of the church to do programming around those sorts of things. So we've got a lot of people who are leaving. So anyway, thank you. Thank you.